CEE,
Central Europe Explained,
an IDM podcast series
powered by Erste Group.
Episode 58. How can democracy fight back? Welcome to Central Europe Explained. In today's episode, How Democracy Can Fight Back, we will talk about the internal and external forces that are coming up against European democracies. In recent years, we've witnessed a growing shift towards far-right, nationalist and authoritarian movements across Europe and beyond. Just recently, for example, Austria saw the extreme right-wing party FPÖ secure victory, and the United States, Donald Trump has just been re-elected. Other European countries are experiencing increasing parliamentary fragmentation and are having difficulties forming new governments, for example, Bulgaria. And there are also growing disinformation campaigns that continue to influence public opinion and polarize society. Democracy is under threat. And this is not only affecting political landscapes, it's influencing everyday life, social stability, and the future of democratic values. I'm Sophia Beiter, Research Associate at the Institute for the Danube Region in Central Europe, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Dr. Kinga Brudzinska. Kinga grew up in Poland, but also lived in Slovakia for some time, and now she's back in her home country. Kinga has spent more than 10 years working on EU policy analysis, which has given her an excellent understanding of how European democracies, especially in the Visegrad countries, are confronting the rising threats. But today, we'll talk to Kinga not just as an expert, but also as a citizen who is directly impacted by these changes. Kinga, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Sophia. Thank you for the invitation.
Kinga, before we dive into the policy side, I'd love to hear about your personal experience with these issues. Living in Central Europe, a region that has experienced notable right-wing shifts, but as in the case of Poland, recently also saw a return to more rule of law-based pro-European government, how do you personally feel about the current political landscape? Does it affect you as a mother, as a woman, and as a citizen?
Thank you very much for this question and also touching on this personal aspect, because as you said, this is not only about the policies and politics, but it has a direct impact on our lives. Maybe I will share exactly the situation, how do I see it in Poland. What I think is the most difficult side of fighting against populists and far-right parties is that it's extremely difficult to reverse the changes or policies that they have put in place. Here I have in mind, for example, the breach of the rule of law, but also, for example, the abortion rights in Poland. Even though for almost a year, we had just the first birthday of the new government in Poland on the 15th of October, some of the policies could have not been reversed. And even though 3 out of 4 coalition partners in the ruling government, they are pro-choice, they couldn't, for example, reverse or make abortion more available to women. The same goes for the rule of law. If the government wants to get in track and do not breach again the law, because this is all a slippery slope, then, we had some advances, but still judiciary system requires a lot of changes and reforms. And foremost, also in our system, the president would cooperate and actually sign the bills that are prepared by the government. So it's not only about getting back to power, but also to making policies work or put them in practice. And I think this has the biggest impact, not only for our generation, but foremost for the future generations, that they will have to live with some changes, for example, that could have not been easily reversed.
Thank you very much for these insights. Many of us feel a kind of helplessness also seeing these changes around us. How do you manage those feelings, knowing what you know about political trends and policies? Do you feel that your understanding of the political landscape gives you hope, or makes it actually harder to be optimistic?
Sometimes if you know too much, it's then maybe the words is even more complex because you dive into the details and you probably construct more scenarios that actually are in place. But I think we live in times where changes are taking place very fast. And also some reasonable decisions go against popular will. And we live in times where actually surprises are more common than normal political developments. And here I have in mind, of course, the elections in the United States, where until the very end, very professional polling agencies were telling us that it's almost 50-50. And when we woke up in the morning of the 5th of November, we learned that Donald Trump not only won, but he received a huge popular support as a president, but also in both chamber of the commerce. So I think political developments is one big question mark, and we just have to take it every day as it comes and do not foresight in a more deep way.
We mentioned now already quite a few countries where we saw elections this year where many far-right and nationalist groups and parties and candidates gained votes. And I would be very interested, from your perspective, what are the key factors driving the rise in populism and authoritarianism across Europe?
I think that those factors are diverse and different in each member states, and there are different shades of those political parties or movements. But when I would have to name few factors, I think the first comes to my mind is economic situation, right? With the high inflation and then post-pandemic shock, people just feel that they are not doing economically well. The purchasing power is lower than expected. So they started to question economic policies of the governments. And here the next interconnected issue would be Green Deal. I think 5 years ago, when the new commission was setting up its priorities, the Green Deal was on the top of the agenda. But nowadays, we see that people feel that those policies cannot come at the cost of their daily life. And this just has costed them too much, and they would like to see some adjustment. Another factor would be migration policy. People feel in Europe that foreigners come and they live out on their social benefits, and there's more maybe violence in their neighborhoods, and they associate those issues with the inflow of immigrants to Europe. Depending on probably where you live in Europe, but from Warsaw, there is also a sense of lack of security. And I think the feeling that the war is just across our border can be felt much more. At least I feel it much more than when I lived in Bratislava or in Vienna. And there is this feeling that anything might happen. And now also with the election of Donald Trump and certain lack of knowledge of what his policy looked like towards Ukraine and Russia, there's just this sense of anxiety, I would say, of what will come in next months. So people are looking for strong leaders or those who offer simple solutions for those difficult times. And sometimes those movements and very strong personalities appeal to them more often. And this is just, of course, generalization, but I think they have something in common when it comes to the rise of those movements in Europe.
Let's maybe also talk about the EU elections that took place in June and that also revealed significant gains for far-right parties, despite also the claims that the political center remains stable. With the European Conservatives and Reformists, the Patriots and the Europe of Sovereign Nations, we now have actually three prominent far-right political groups in the European Parliament. How do you view these groups? What are their main goals for the EU? And what can we expect from them in the upcoming legislative period? Would you say they are dangerous for democracy in the EU?
I think, as you said, even though the mainstream political parties in the European Parliament maintain the majority, there are certain shifts that are inevitable. And when we look at the results and compare from 2019 and 2014, we can see that now we have, as you said, third political fraction is the Patriots for Europe. They have 84 seats. European Conservatives and Reformists, 78. And then only Renew Europe, the biggest winner of 2019 elections, the number of seats dropped almost by 20 seats. And then we also have the new grouping, Europe of Sovereign Nations, and they are the smallest but still significant group in the parliament. Under this new parliament, the mainstream parties were successful to keep the cordon sanitaire, which means that members of those parties were not allowed or not selected to be chair of commissions or running the committees. So they have less influence on setting the political agenda of European working groups and workings of the European Parliament. Even though they, of course, are heard and their policies are also, they pronounce or articulate their priorities louder. Their disadvantage, probably when making an impact of the whole European Parliament, is that this group is divided. After the elections, when still the groups were forming and there were negotiations between them, some analysts thought that maybe they will unite, which means that they could have even been the second strongest force in the European Parliament, but it was not possible. For example, the biggest changes were provoked by the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who was not accepted to join the European Conservatives and Reformists, and he formed his new group together with Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen, and they created a new powerful political group, Patriots for Europe. We also have seen the last moment of European campaign, the AfD from Germany, who also was forced to leave their political group and form a new political fraction. So I would say, to make a long story short, their priorities are heard, but for now they don't have that much power as they want to be to influence the future of priorities or policies set up in the European Parliament. Actually, those days we have a very interesting developments during the confirmations of commissioners, because everything went smoothly. The 26 commissioners hearings took place between 4th and 12th of November. And on the last day, we had one of the vice presidents candidate for one of the posts of vice president of the European Commission, Raffaele Fitto from Italy, who hearing didn't go so well, or where we could see the most infightings within the parliament between those different groups, because the Liberals and the Greens, they think that a candidate from the radical right party from Italy should not have such a prominent role and position in the European Commission. And in fact, this might block the whole confirmation of the whole commission and postpone it for even 1 month. But Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, agreed to give Italians such a post, actually to have a bigger majority, or also to include the positions of European Conservatives and Reformists into the workings of the European Commission. And this is seen by her coalition partners as something that is not acceptable. So we will see what happens next week. But those tensions between the political group persist, and still the negotiations are very heated.
I also find it very interesting that this nomination of Raffaele Fitto as vice president from the ECR, it shows that the cordon sanitaire has already moved a bit to the right, and it seems like that. So as soon as there is a group that is more on the right than a group that already exists, it also normalizes this other group some kind of. So it seems like now we have two groups that are more right than the ECR. The ECR seems to have been normalized a little bit too.
Yes, it's a very good point. And I think this is also the strategy, for example, right, when it comes to migration policy. We've seen that today the line of European Commission or discussions in the European Council are actually of the language of far-right parties. For when I was writing article actually during the European Parliament elections on Germany, I found the declarations from AfD, and they were already speaking about treating root causes of migration, externalization of migration policy, and also they alluded to opening the asylum centers in the third countries. And yet, few years has passed, and now Ursula von der Leyen, in her invitation letter to the leaders for the European Council, I think back in October, she said that this is a topic that is open for discussion. Some language that we would not see or could not have accepted 5 years ago. But because of the member states, migration is such a hot topic again, then yes, this discussion certainly moves to further right in the political spectrum.
Considering the political landscape shifting and the strong presence of right-wing parties in the European Parliament, do you think the EU is prepared to counteract these trends? What steps are being taken, if any, to protect the core democratic values that Europe was built upon?
I think this is a question that is difficult to answer, but this is something that I think our leaders are thinking every day, what policy to take. First, not to lose support base that has so far voted for them, but on the other hand, make their program more appealing to the voters that vote more populists. And this is something that I think we've just talked about also kind of rewriting maybe or adjusting priorities to new realities, but also, of course, with some red lines. But I think what is also being discussed, maybe I will allude to once again to the Polish case, because we have a lot of now discussions and preparations are taking on for the Polish presidency in the EU Council. And the government will announce the priorities in mid-December. But already we have discussions on the topics and priorities, what they should be and what they are. So the priority of the Polish presidency will be security in a broad sense and in different dimensions. Of course, defense, military security, but also energy one, health security is one of the priorities. But also they talk a lot about the security of information space, about countering fake news and also media literacy initiatives among children and youth, but also what is really interesting about the seniors. So I think there is a broad understanding that given the social media platforms and impact that they have both on young generation, but also elderly, something has to be done so people get information, that they get facts and not fake news that are gaining a lot of likes and spread more easily.
As you already spoke about the youth, we're also seeing increased polarization among the younger generation. Many young people are increasingly leaning towards right-wing ideologies. How do you interpret this shift, and what do you think is contributing to it?
This is also was my question to you as well, because I think you are a bigger expert than I do on Austria and Germany. But I think this is something that was appealing from Germany and the elections to the Landtags, where the AfD actually made so much gains, and also the Sarah Wagenknecht party, where, from what I understand, attracted also a lot of young people. So I will actually be interested to hear from you or your experience as well and your thoughts. But what I'm thinking about young people as well, that they look on economic aspect as well, but also the TikTok diplomacy and the influencers have a huge impact on the voting right. And also this, what I mentioned before, that leaders who have simple solutions for difficult problems are someone who provides clarity and helps to make choices easier and better for them.
Yeah, I would agree with that also, that I think social media plays such a big role for the young generation. And I think, yeah, it's a lot of far right or populist parties that are very successful on social media or that are using social media very well. I read about that there is this tendency that traditional values become more important for young men. They become more conservative and they are more looking towards a strong leader. which they also find more on the far right. But in general, yeah, I think it's also a feeling of being left alone, maybe. And what I think in regards, for example, to the topic of migration, I just think it's also a big fault of the other parties, the mainstream parties, to failed in framing this topic more positively, because lots of the countries or all countries in the region, we need labor. There's labor shortage. So I think there would have been maybe especially from social democrats there would have been this possibility to frame this topic in a more positive way, but nobody did that, and instead just took over basically the narratives from the far right in a not so drastic way, but still fueling the feeling of being threatened by migrants, and not counteracting that or bringing up a different narrative.
Maybe I would just follow up because I think this is interesting that from what I understand, also in Austria, still those post-pandemic problems were still present in the campaign. And when we were locked at homes, we thought maybe Austria is one of the most responsible countries that make vaccines obligatory to everyone. And it felt like they have a clear strategy and path to keep all citizens safe. But after all those years, it's fires back, and still Herbert Kickl was using this policy against the ruling government.
One challenge is getting citizens to engage actively in protecting democracy. What are some practical ways that you believe citizens, maybe also especially young people, can get involved in reducing polarization and strengthening democracy in Europe?
I think that citizens' engagement is really important, and there is some role to play of our governments actually to make those debates available and possible, and actually help the citizens to form such a platforms where they would be able to meet. And I think all of this has to start at school, where the young minds are just being shaped, and they have to be educated in the way that different does not mean worse, but different means also something that should be accepted, but also it's interesting and worth discussing. So this culture of debates is really important at the very early stage. And I think this is still missing from our school curriculum. And those gaps could be filled, for example, by some civil society organizations that have very big experience in this field. It was always my dream project that still has not come true. When I lived in Bratislava, it's to organize between regions cross multinational dialogues. So let's say we are in Bratislava, and then we have 20 minutes drive to Austria and to Hungary. But still, I think the people don't know much about each other. So it would be great to organize for them such a sessions. I mean, in a probably more mid-term, looking into a year-long projects, where we would invite them together and provide translations into their native languages. So people across generations and from different fields can meet and actually talk to each other and discuss the problems of their regions, but also, for example, add a discussion on European citizenship or future of Europe, of what kind of Europe they would like. And I think in this format, we would notice that those problems are similar, and it would be maybe more easier for them to understand each other and be open to the otherness in the future.
That sounds very nice. I hope to see this project come true one day. It would be nice.
Logistically very difficult, and also this is something that has to be done. Preparations probably last longer than implementation of the project itself, but I think yes, it's worth trying one day again.
Thank you so much for your insights, Kinga. Now, before we wrap up, as we always do at the end of an episode, we'd love to hear a recommendation from you. Is there a book, film, or maybe another piece of art that you feel captures the essence of this struggle for democracy, or something that might help listeners understand these issues in a more nuanced way?
What I would recommend is a report and a book. So one very interesting report that came out in April this year. It's a report by Carnegie Europe, charting the radicals' influence on the EU foreign policy, where they have study cases of the countries, but also they provide interactive map with different aspects of foreign policy and how those radical right parties look at them from their capitals. So I think it's a very comprehensive study, but also gives a sense of what those radical right party positions are in a certain topics. It relates to foreign policy, but I think it's very precise and interesting to dive in. And then when it comes to a book, I still have not read it, so it's in my bookshelf. It's a new book of Ann Applebaum, a renowned journalist, but privately also wife of Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, called Autocracy INC, Dictators Who Want to Run the World, where she explains about the mechanism of how the autocracies work nowadays. And what I found very compelling from the review is that she says it's no like in the past that the country is run by one strong leaders, but it's more like a corporations where there are different interest groups that interact with each others, and they also cooperate with like-minded partners from the countries that are run in a similar way. So I think it's a very complex and interesting book to read that I will also read in upcoming week.
Thank you so much, Kinga, for these recommendations. And thank you so much for joining this fight for democracy today. It was a real pleasure talking to you. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode. And look out for more of Central Europe Explained. Until next time, bye-bye.
This was CEE, Central Europe Explained, a podcast series produced by the Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe. If you enjoyed listening to us, make sure to subscribe to the IDM podcast series on your favorite podcast platform. Additionally, you can explore our other work on our website www.idm.at. If you have any feedback or if you're interested in collaborating on a podcast episode, please do not hesitate to contact us through our social media channels at IDM Vienna or write us an email to idm@idm.at.
IDM Podcast.
Institut für den Donauraum und Mitteleuropa.
Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe.
European perspectives.
Regional actions.
Cooperation and expertise since 1953.